began on a humid Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavy and even the birds seem to fall silent. The small suburban neighborhood of Willow Grove had always carried an illusion of peace. Trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, pastel-painted homes, everything perfectly symmetrical, perfectly controlled. But beneath that pristine surface a quiet tyranny ruled. The HOA, led by one woman whose name struck fear into every homeowner, Karen Millstone. Karen wasn't merely a neighbor. She was the self-appointed warden of the community, the type of person who believed a misplaced trash bin was an act of rebellion. Her clipboard was her weapon, her sunglasses her shield, and her temper, unpredictable, scorching, and often public. She saw everything, controlled everything, and when she couldn't, she destroyed it. 2 streets away from her home stood the modest house of Police Chief Daniel Grayson. To the HOA, he was just Dan, the quiet single father. He had moved in 2 years ago after his wife's passing, seeking a quieter place to raise his daughter Lily, a bright 12-year-old with a weak heart but an unbreakable spirit. Lily's heart condition had required surgeries, rest, and careful monitoring. Her father had installed a medical alert system, kept oxygen tanks inside, and ensured she was never without supervision. For months, Karen had made her distaste for the Graysons' unkept porch known. She despised the small wheelchair ramp Daniel had installed for Lily. "It breaks the neighborhood aesthetic," she said once in an email to the HOA board, calling it an eyesore. She hated the oxygen tanks that sat by the window and the medical supplies she sometimes glimpsed through the curtains. To her, it wasn't a matter of empathy, it was a matter of order. That Thursday, Daniel was called into an unexpected briefing downtown. A new string of burglaries had shaken the county, and his department needed him immediately. He left Lily under the care of her nurse, Carla, who had stepped out briefly to pick up a prescription. Lily, safe on the porch swing, enjoyed the afternoon sun with her small portable oxygen supply at her side. Then Karen arrived. From the moment she spotted Lily on that swing, a spark of irritation ignited inside her. In Karen's mind, the ramp, the oxygen tanks, even the child herself, they all clashed with the neighborhood's standards. Her face twisted with disgust as she marched up the walkway, clipboard in hand, fury in her stride. What happened next would shatter the illusion of control she had so carefully built. Neighbors would later recall hearing a commotion, the sharp metallic clinking of a chain, a cry, and then silence. By the time Carla returned, Lily was sitting motionless on the porch, her ankle shackled to the swing's iron frame with a heavy steel chain, the kind Karen used for her no parking signs. The oxygen supply had been knocked over, its hose bent and leaking slowly onto the wooden boards. Panic surged through Carla as she rushed forward, fumbling with the lock, calling Lily's name. The child was conscious but pale, trembling, frightened, her pulse erratic. "She said I wasn't allowed to move," Lily whispered weakly, her voice trembling. Karen had chained a sick child because she thought she wasn't supposed to be outside. When Daniel got the call, he was still in uniform. The radio crackled as the dispatcher's voice broke through. A disturbance at his own address. He didn't even wait for the full report, his tires screamed as he tore down the highway, sirens silent, rage boiling under the surface like lava beneath a calm mountain. When he arrived, he saw his daughter, his only child, sitting on that porch, pale as porcelain, a rusted chain locked around her ankle. The smell of spilled oxygen filled the air. Karen stood nearby, flanked by 2 HOA board members, completely unbothered, insisting she had every right to restrain the child for breaking community rules. Daniel's world stopped spinning. The neighbors watched from their windows, some with fear, others with disbelief. The police chief's jaw tightened as he walked up the steps, his hand hovering near his badge, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't move fast. He simply looked at his daughter, her fragile hands trembling, and at the woman who had dared to touch her. In that moment, Karen had no idea who she had crossed, because Daniel wasn't just a father, he was the law. And in the span of a heartbeat, he made a silent vow. He would destroy the empire Karen had built, piece by piece. That day marked the end of the HOA's reign over Willow Grove. But the war that followed would turn the quiet suburban neighborhood into a battlefield of justice, power, and revenge. That night, after Lily had been safely taken to the hospital, Daniel stood alone on his porch, staring at the broken chain still lying there, a cruel symbol of control. The street was eerily quiet, yet he could feel the eyes of the neighborhood watching him. The HOA had always believed they were untouchable. By morning, they would learn how wrong they were. The next morning dawned over Willow Grove in a haze of uneasy silence. The manicured lawns, the pastel fences, and the neat driveways all looked exactly the same, but something invisible had shifted in the air. The neighbors whispered behind curtains, wondering what would come next. For years, Karen Millstone and her HOA board had ruled this place like self-appointed monarchs, issuing fines for crooked mailboxes and threatening homeowners over paint shades. But now, a reckoning loomed on the horizon. Chief Daniel Grayson returned home at dawn, still in his uniform from the night before. His daughter Lily was resting at the hospital, her condition stabilized but fragile. He had stayed by her side until the machines told him she would be safe for the night. Now he stood on his porch, staring at the place where she had been chained like an animal, the lock still cold and gleaming against the morning light. He crouched down, running his gloved hand along the iron frame of the swing, examining the marks on the metal. There were scratches, signs of struggle. A small bruise on the wood beneath it where the oxygen tank had fallen. Every detail spoke to him like an evidence trail, and he read it like a language only he could understand. The father in him wanted to scream. The cop in him began building a case. By mid-morning, unmarked police cars began to quietly roll into Willow Grove. Officers in plain clothes dispersed through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, collecting statements. Word spread fast, faster than truth ever could. Some said Karen had just been trying to help. Others whispered that she had gone too far this time. But none dared speak too loudly. The HOA board had eyes everywhere. Karen herself woke up that morning smug and unapologetic. She hadn't yet realized the depth of what she'd done, or who she had done it to. As she sipped her coffee, she drafted an email to the HOA documenting the incident. Her version painted Lily as a defiant minor trespassing unsupervised, and claimed she had secured the child for her own safety. She even attached photos she had taken, proof she thought of her righteousness. But when two detectives knocked on her door that afternoon, her smile faltered. She expected a warning or maybe a polite chat. Instead, they served her with an official notice. A criminal investigation had been opened: assault, unlawful restraint, endangerment of a minor, and tampering with medical equipment. The moment they said endangerment, her face drained of color. Across the street, neighbors peeked through blinds, watching the queen of the HOA being led to a squad car for questioning. The sound of her protesting echoed through the street, shrill, desperate, defiant. "This is a mistake, I was following regulations." But her words were just noise against the growing murmur of justice. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Daniel didn't attend the interrogation. He refused to. His badge was a symbol of order, not vengeance, and he knew the weight of conflict of interest. But behind the scenes, he orchestrated everything. Every report filed, every statement taken, every photograph cataloged, all flowed into the case file he quietly built like a fortress of truth. The HOA board tried to intervene. They claimed it was a private community matter, not something for law enforcement. They threatened legal action against harassment. But their arrogance only fueled Daniel's determination. He authorized an audit into the HOA's practices, uncovering years of violations, unauthorized fines, intimidation tactics, forged complaints. The more he dug, the darker it got. Soon, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. A local news outlet caught wind of the arrest: HOA chairwoman accused of chaining disabled child. Within hours, it was everywhere. Social media flared up with outrage. Strangers from across the country condemned Karen and the HOA's cruelty. For the first time in her life, Karen wasn't in control. She was a headline. Still, Daniel's victory felt hollow. Sitting in the hospital by Lily's bedside that night, he watched the slow rise and fall of her chest. She looked peaceful, but the memory of her trembling, chained to that porch, burned in his mind like fire. He wanted justice, yes, but something deeper had taken root in him. Something darker. Justice, he knew, was not enough. Not for what she had done. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details. Several neighbors admitted they had seen Karen berating Lily in the past for being outside too long. One claimed Karen had threatened to have the Graysons removed from the community if Daniel did keep the medical equipment out of sight. Another neighbor confessed to hearing Karen boast that she ran this neighborhood like a military base. Every testimony, every document, every grainy photo of Karen's clipboard-filled reign, all of it stacked into a mountain of evidence that couldn't be ignored. When Daniel finally looked over the compiled file, he saw it not just as a criminal case, but as an opportunity. He realized that Karen wasn't just a cruel woman, she was the tip of something bigger. The HOA board had built a private empire, using residents' money for personal luxuries, hiding under the guise of community improvement. The moment Daniel understood that, his mission changed. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about dismantling the entire system that had allowed people like her to rule unchecked. By the end of that week, the HOA board called an emergency meeting to address the misunderstanding. They tried to portray themselves as victims of overreach. Flyers appeared on mailboxes calling for unity and forgiveness. But the neighborhood was no longer listening. Fear had shifted hands. Daniel stood in his living room that night, looking out through the blinds as the board members gathered in Karen's house for their secret meeting. He could see their silhouettes through the curtains, frantic, arguing, desperate to contain the fallout. He didn't plan to stop them, not yet. He wanted them to feel safe again, to believe they could get away with it one more time, because when justice came, it would come like thunder. He opened his laptop and began typing, not as the police chief, not as a father, but as a man who had decided that law alone was not enough. He began drafting a case so complete, so devastating, that it would tear down not just the HOA, but everyone who had hidden behind it. As the cursor blinked on the screen, Daniel's reflection stared back at him, cold, focused, unstoppable. The chain on the porch had been just the beginning. And deep down, Karen Millstone, sitting in her house across the street, sipping cheap wine to drown her panic, had no idea that the man she had mocked, the neighbor she had fined, was about to end her kingdom forever. The days that followed were a storm building in slow motion. What began as gossip on front lawns became murmurs in grocery aisles, and soon a full-blown scandal engulfed Willow Grove. Every whisper carried Daniel Grayson's name and Karen Millstone's shame. Yet while the world focused on the spectacle, Daniel was quietly orchestrating something far greater behind the scenes. He spent every night in his home office, surrounded by case files, printed emails, and HOA meeting transcripts. The deeper he went, the more he realized that Karen's cruelty wasn't an isolated act. It was the symptom of a corrupted system built on greed and intimidation. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was running a racket. Fines for unauthorized paint colors were funneled into a shadow account. Landscaping fees that homeowners paid never went to contractors, they disappeared into shell companies tied to Karen's relatives. Daniel discovered signed HOA checks to fake vendors, inflated invoices, and personal purchases hidden as community maintenance. It was white-collar crime in pastel wrapping, concealed behind smiles and flower beds. As he built his case, Daniel was methodical. Every document he found was scanned, every statement backed by video or timestamp photograph. He didn't want revenge fueled by rage. He wanted precision, a downfall so complete it would make headlines, arrests, and reform. Meanwhile, Karen's life was coming apart thread by thread. After her release on bail, she returned home to a neighborhood that no longer bowed to her. Her once loyal board members avoided her calls. The smug confidence that had once defined her melted into paranoia. Curtains were drawn at all hours. She began packing the windows, convinced that everyone was watching, and she was right, they were. Her reputation had become poison. Children whispered her name like a curse. Homeowners filed official complaints against the HOA. A group of residents even started a petition to dissolve it entirely. For the first time, the power she had hoarded was slipping away, faster than she could grasp. But Karen wasn't one to surrender easily. Late one evening, under the dim glow of her living room lamp, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Only 3 of the 7 members showed up. Her once iron grip over them was now reduced to pleading tones and nervous glances. She ordered them to find dirt on Daniel to prove that he had abused his authority. She spoke with venom, insisting that the only reason he was going after her was personal revenge. But even as she barked orders, her voice trembled. There was fear in it now, and she knew it. While Karen schemed, Daniel's operation moved quietly through official channels. With the help of his trusted deputy, a federal liaison was contacted. Fraud investigators were briefed. The state attorney's office was informed. Slowly, the trap was being set. Every step of the process was deliberate, every motion calculated. Daniel wasn't just dismantling an HOA, he was exposing an empire built on coercion. Then came the turning point. One evening, as Daniel reviewed financial records, a name kept recurring: Millstone Management LLC, a business registered under Karen's husband, Harold. On paper, it was a property maintenance company. In reality, it was the funnel through which HOA money disappeared. They had built their wealth on the very people they claimed to serve. Daniel leaned back in his chair, realization washing over him. This wasn't just fraud, it was theft on a massive scale, funded by homeowners who had lived in fear of Karen's clipboard for years. He decided it was time to tighten the noose. The next morning, Karen woke to a sight that made her blood run cold. Police cars lined her driveway. Neighbors peeked from their windows as officers carried boxes of files and computers from her home. Her husband protested, shouting about unlawful seizure, but his words fell on deaf ears. The warrant was airtight, signed, sealed, and executed under Daniel's direction. For the first time, the neighborhood saw the real power shift, the fall of a tyrant under the weight of her own corruption. That night, the HOA's email server went offline. Its website displayed a simple message: under investigation. Karen sat alone in her kitchen, her world collapsing around her. The phone rang constantly, reporters, lawyers, even board members begging for help. She ignored them all, staring blankly at the chain she had used on Lily, now resting on the table like a ghost of her arrogance. But she wasn't finished, not yet. Humiliation had turned into obsession. She convinced herself that Daniel had fabricated evidence, that he had used his badge to destroy her for revenge. She started documenting everything: tailing his car, photographing his house, even following Lily's nurse to the hospital. The line between reality and paranoia blurred until she saw enemies in every shadow. Daniel noticed it too. The same black SUV parked down the block, the same figure watching from across the street at night. He didn't react. He wanted her to dig deeper, to get desperate, because the more she fought, the more evidence she left behind. And she did. Within weeks, investigators found that Karen had tampered with HOA records after the raid, deleting files, shredding documents, and moving funds offshore. It wasn't just obstruction of justice anymore. It was a full-scale criminal conspiracy. As the legal noose tightened, the community transformed. The residents, once silent and fearful, began speaking up. They shared stories of fines for imaginary violations, of threats, of harassment. They had been hostages in their own neighborhood, ruled by fear of Karen's wrath. But now they saw Daniel not just as a neighbor, but as a liberator. The walls of Willow Grove, once so quiet, now echoed with voices of defiance. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before were united by a common cause: freedom. Karen's world, her illusion of control, her empire of rules, her facade of perfection, was unraveling faster than she could rebuild it. The woman who once patrolled the streets with a clipboard now sat in a darkened house, drowning in silence, watching her kingdom burn from the inside out. And Daniel Grayson, standing on his porch one quiet night, finally allowed himself a small breath. It wasn't over, not yet, but the tide had turned. Justice was no longer an idea. It was in motion, unstoppable. He looked toward Karen's house, its blinds drawn tight, and knew she was still inside, plotting, panicking, breaking. What she didn't know was that the next move had already been made. A grand jury had been convened, indictments were being drafted, and soon her fall wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a spectacle. By the time dawn broke over Willow Grove the following Monday, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The air that once smelled of fresh-cut grass and polite hypocrisy now carried the heavy scent of tension. Mailboxes overflowed with court summonses and HOA refund claims. The perfect silence of suburban order had been shattered, replaced by the relentless murmur of reporters, flashing cameras, and murmured curses. Karen Millstone's world was crumbling, but she refused to accept it. Her home, once the command center of the HOA's rule, had turned into a fortress of denial. Curtains drawn, gates locked, security cameras blinking red. Inside, the house reeked of stress: empty wine glasses, stacks of crumpled papers, and the glow of a laptop screen showing breaking news about her own disgrace. Every channel replayed the same footage: officers carrying boxes from her house, her name linked to fraud, corruption, and the unthinkable cruelty toward a child. The world she had built on fear was now turning on her. Still, Karen convinced herself she could fight it. She told her husband Harold that this was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. She believed she could twist the story, manipulate public sympathy, and paint Daniel Grayson as an overreaching cop seeking personal revenge. But deep down, her confidence was hollow, a cracked mask hiding panic. Meanwhile, Daniel Grayson was preparing for the reckoning in silence. In his office, lit only by the faint hum of a desk lamp, he reviewed the final draft of the criminal report. Weeks of investigation had culminated in a mountain of evidence: falsified invoices, offshore transfers, intimidation letters signed under Karen's authority. The case was airtight. He had built it like an architect: precise, deliberate, irrefutable. Yet despite his calm exterior, Daniel was haunted by one image: his daughter chained to the porch. Every document he filed, every arrest he authorized was driven by that memory. This wasn't just law enforcement. This was personal justice. The reckoning began quietly. At sunrise, multiple warrants were executed simultaneously. Officers raided the homes of HOA board members across the county. Computers were seized, bank accounts frozen, and hidden ledgers uncovered. The facade of neighborhood perfection cracked wide open as headlines exploded: police chief exposes HOA corruption ring. Suburban power broker faces charges of child endangerment and fraud. Karen's phone began ringing nonstop. Board members turned on her instantly, cutting deals, nomming names, surrendering evidence. Her so-called allies were now witnesses. She was alone, the queen abandoned by her court. When officers returned to her home with a new warrant, this time for arrest, Karen was no longer the commanding figure she once was. She greeted them with trembling hands, mascara smudged, and defiance gone from her voice. The camera crews waiting outside captured every second of it, her face pale, eyes hollow, the clipboard she once wielded now useless on her kitchen counter. As she was escorted to the waiting patrol car, neighbors lined the sidewalks. Some watched in stunned silence, others whispered curses under their breath. For years they had lived under her shadow, fined for flowers planted too close to the sidewalk, threatened for leaving toys in the yard. Now they watched their tormentor led away, powerless at last. But the reckoning wasn't just about Karen. Daniel had seen to that. In the weeks that followed, forensic accountants exposed a web of corruption stretching far beyond Willow Grove. The HOA was linked to dozens of other neighborhoods, all under the Millstone management umbrella. Millions of dollars in misused funds, dozens of victims silenced through intimidation and lawsuits. It was a national scandal now, with news vans parked along the once idyllic streets. Karen's empire had become her cage. During her arraignment, the courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled frantically, flashes flickered, and whispers rippled through the audience. Daniel sat quietly at the back, his badge tucked beneath his jacket. He wasn't there for spectacle, he was there for closure. Karen stood before the judge, her voice trembling as the charges were read: fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, unlawful restraint, child endangerment. Each word struck like a hammer. And when the prosecutor mentioned Lily by name, Karen's eyes darted across the room and found Daniel. For a moment, everything went silent. She saw no anger in his gaze, no satisfaction, just calm finality, the look of a man who had already won long before the gavel would fall. The judge denied bail. Karen was led away in handcuffs, her shoulders slumped, her reign officially ended. But even in defeat, she couldn't stop whispering, claiming she had been set up, that Daniel had used his position, that she was the real victim. Her words fell flat against the cold walls of justice. Outside the courthouse, Daniel faced the press for the first time. Cameras surrounded him, microphones thrust forward, but he said little. His voice was low, measured, steady, the tone of a man who didn't need to prove anything. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "It's about accountability. No one is above the law, not even those who write their own." His words echoed through headlines across the nation. Back in Willow Grove, the community began to heal. The HOA was officially dissolved and a new homeowners' council was formed, one built on transparency and respect. The fear that once haunted the streets was gone. Children played outside again, neighbors smiled at each other without glancing over their shoulders. And Daniel, though praised as a hero, never called himself one. He spent his evenings by Lily's bedside, reading her stories, watching her laugh again. For the first time in years, their home felt safe. Yet deep inside, he knew justice was not the end, it was only the beginning of rebuilding. Still, not everyone accepted the peace. In the quiet of her jail cell, Karen Millstone sat alone under flickering fluorescent light. The chain of her restraint, cold, metallic, and final, clinked softly whenever she moved. Her mind, however, refused to rest. She told herself it wasn't over, that she would find a way to destroy Daniel, that people like her always found a way back. But as the prison door shut for the night and the sound of metal echoed down the corridor, she realized something she had never felt before. Power wasn't control, power was consequence, and hers had finally come due. Outside, the night was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet that had once suffocated Willow Grove. This silence was peaceful, free. Daniel stood on his porch, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain. He looked up at the sky, his daughter asleep inside, the house lights glowing softly behind him. The reckoning was over, justice had spoken. But he knew one truth too well: in neighborhoods like this, evil never truly vanished. It only hid, waiting for complacency to return. He vowed it never would. Because now everyone in Willow Grove knew what happened when you crossed the wrong man and chained the wrong child. The world moved on, but Willow Grove could not. Months after Karen Millstone's arrest, the neighborhood still carried the scars of her rule, invisible but deep. The lawns grew uneven, the hedges overgrew the neat lines once obsessively maintained, and the HOA signs that had once stood like monuments of control were now rusting reminders of what had been. Some residents called it freedom, others called it chaos, but to all it was a reckoning that had changed everything. Karen's trial dominated the news cycle. Her face, once a symbol of authority, had become synonymous with greed, cruelty, and arrogance. National outlets dissected every detail of the case. Talk shows debated it. Legal analysts marveled at how a suburban HOA scandal had spiraled into a federal corruption case. She was now the infamous HOA Queen of Chains. Behind every headline, though, Daniel Grayson remained quiet. He had done his duty. He had kept his promise. But the aftermath weighed on him more than he had expected. Even in victory, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. The justice system had done its part, but the memories lingered. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily on that porch, the chain glinting in the sunlight, her small hand trembling as she reached for him. He thought it would fade with time. It didn't. Still, he returned to work. The department had praised him, the mayor had offered a commendation, and his colleagues treated him with reverence. Yet Daniel refused the medal, refused the press conferences. He wasn't interested in glory. What he wanted, what he needed, was peace. But peace never came easy. One quiet morning, as he drove through Willow Grove on his way to the station, he noticed a for sale sign on Karen's old property. The once pristine home was now empty, foreclosed, the shutters hanging loose, the lawn unkempt. The symbol of her dominance had decayed into ruin. He slowed his car, watching as a gust of wind knocked over a cracked HOA enforcement area sign lying in the grass. It hit the ground with a hollow clang, a sound that felt like closure. And yet something inside him stirred. Because while Karen sat behind bars awaiting sentencing, not everyone had accepted her downfall. A handful of former HOA loyalists, people who had thrived under her authority, began whispering about what Daniel had done. They claimed the investigation was tainted, that he had used his position to exact revenge. Online forums filled with conspiracy theories and fabricated screenshots. Some of Karen's followers even visited the police department, demanding her release, calling her a victim of power abuse. They didn't care about the evidence. They only cared about their illusion of order, the rules that had given them control. Daniel ignored the noise at first. He had expected it. Power attracts rot, and cleaning it out never happens quietly. But then the threats began. Anonymous letters in his mailbox, slashed tires on his cruiser, messages left on his doorstep: "She'll be free soon." Each act was small, but each one chipped away at his calm. Meanwhile, in the county detention center, Karen was far from broken. Isolation had given her time to plot. Her arrogance had evolved into something sharper, obsession disguised as resolve. She spent her days writing letters, dozens of them, to reporters, lawyers, even former HOA allies. Each one twisted the story further, portraying herself as the true victim, the woman who had saved a child in distress and been punished by corrupt law enforcement. And the terrifying thing, some believed her. The online narrative shifted subtly. Hashtags appeared. Articles questioning Daniel's conflict of interest began circulating. One reporter even filed a Freedom of Information request for Daniel's case notes, hinting at impropriety. What had once been a clear-cut case of justice was now becoming a public controversy. The fallout had begun. Daniel's department stood by him, but the pressure mounted. Every day he faced cameras outside the precinct, reporters shouting questions, the glint of microphones catching the early sun. Some of his own officers warned him to lay low, that powerful people were now watching, people who didn't like what he had exposed. The HOA system was bigger than one neighborhood, and Karen's conviction threatened to unravel more than anyone had anticipated. The house of cards was collapsing nationwide. Across the state, investigations opened into other HOAs linked to Millstone management. Board members resigned in disgrace. Suburban communities long ruled by fear suddenly faced chaos as their leaders vanished overnight. For the first time, ordinary homeowners realized how deep the corruption ran. To many, Daniel Grayson became a symbol, a man who had stood up to a system built on control. But to others, he was a warning. What happens when authority fights authority? At night, Daniel sat on his porch watching the streetlights flicker, listening to the quiet hum of crickets. Lily's laughter drifted from inside, a sound that grounded him. She was healing, that was what mattered, but even she sensed the shift in him. The once steady, unshakable father now carried a silent edge, a weariness she couldn't name but felt in every pause between his breaths. He had won the battle, but victory, he realized, doesn't erase damage, it only exposes what was broken beneath. Then came the news he had dreaded. Karen Millstone's lawyers filed a motion and appeal. Claiming procedural misconduct, they demanded a retrial. The argument that Daniel's personal involvement compromised the investigation's integrity. It was a long shot, but it was enough to reopen wounds that had barely begun to close. The media swarmed again, opinion pieces debated the ethics of his role, commentators dissected every decision he made. The noise grew louder. Daniel knew she was behind it. Every headline, every rumor, every carefully planted seed of doubt, all part of Karen's revenge, even from within her cell. She couldn't control the neighborhood anymore. But she could still control perception. The fallout wasn't just public, it was psychological. Daniel started losing sleep. The lines between duty and vengeance blurred in his mind. He questioned his choices, replayed every step of the investigation, wondering if he had been too ruthless, too personal. He had upheld the law, but had he crossed its spirit? One night, unable to sleep, he drove back to Willow Grove's community park, the same park where Karen had once demanded neighbors get approval before planting flowers. The benches were empty now, the playground creaked in the wind. He sat beneath the dim streetlight, the night whispering with ghosts of what used to be. Then he noticed something. At the far edge of the park, nailed to a tree, was a sign, a new one. A fresh piece of laminated paper that read, HOA coming back, sign up for restoration meeting. No logo, no name, just a date and an address. Daniel tore it down slowly, his jaw tightening. Someone, maybe her loyalist, maybe her husband, was trying to rebuild, trying to resurrect what he had destroyed. He crumpled the paper in his fist. The battle wasn't over, it was changing form. As the night deepened, Daniel drove home in silence, headlights cutting through fog. The past, it seemed, had no intention of staying buried. The reckoning had brought justice, but justice had consequences. And now those consequences were crawling back, darker and more insidious than before. In the distance, thunder rolled. And Daniel Grayson knew that before peace could return to Willow Grove, one final storm had to break. The rain came without warning, thick, relentless, and heavy, washing over Willow Grove like a baptism of reckoning. Streets shimmered with reflection, gutters overflowed, and the neighborhood that had once stood for control now looked like a drowned relic of a forgotten empire. The last storm of autumn had arrived, but for Daniel Grayson it was something more. It was the night everything came full circle. 3 weeks had passed since the notice appeared, the flyer announcing the restoration meeting. Despite his efforts to shut it down, Daniel's quiet inquiries revealed something alarming. A small faction of homeowners, the same few who had once whispered behind Karen Millstone's clipboard, were attempting to revive the HOA under a new name, the Willow Grove Civic Association. A legal disguise, but the same rot beneath the surface. And worse, the meeting was being organized by Harold Millstone, Karen's husband. Since her imprisonment, Harold had avoided public attention, presenting himself as a grieving spouse caught in his wife's mistakes. But Daniel knew better. The money trail from the original investigation had led to Harold's name again and again. He had been the silent partner, the handler of accounts, the architect who built the empire Karen had ruled. While Karen wielded control through intimidation, Harold wielded it through wealth. Now, with his wife behind bars, he was rebuilding what she had lost. The storm hit hardest that evening, the same night Harold scheduled his first community restoration meeting at the old HOA clubhouse. The irony was not lost on Daniel. That place, once a beacon of suburban order, had been abandoned for months, its windows cracked, its lights long since cut off. Yet tonight they glowed again. As thunder rolled in the distance, Daniel sat in his car just outside the entrance, watching. He wasn't there as the police chief tonight, he was there as a father and as a man unwilling to let evil return to his doorstep. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see figures gathering inside, half a dozen people, faces familiar from the old regime. Clipboards, folders, nervous smiles, they weren't just reminiscing. They were planning, rebuilding the machine that had once nearly cost his daughter her life. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He knew he couldn't arrest them for meeting, not yet. But he also knew that corruption always began in small, quiet rooms just like this. As lightning flashed across the sky, he stepped out into the downpour. Every step toward that clubhouse echoed like judgment. The rain soaked through his uniform, the mud pulling at his boots, but he didn't slow. He could feel his pulse, steady, heavy, cold. The same pulse he'd felt the day he found Lily on the porch, chained and afraid. The same fire that had driven him through the months of investigation, the hearings, the threats. Inside, voices rose above the storm. Harold's voice. Daniel paused by the window, peering through the fogged glass. Harold stood at the front of the room, his tone calm, rehearsed. He spoke of rebuilding unity, of forgiving the past, of restoring order. But beneath those polished words, Daniel heard the same poison that had corrupted Willow Grove for years. Control disguised as community, fear disguised as structure. It wasn't remorse that brought Harold back. It was ambition. And then Harold said it, the line that made Daniel's blood turn to ice. He promised that when Karen returns, she will lead again, stronger than ever. That was it. Daniel pushed open the door, the room went silent, heads turned. The sight of him, drenched, badge glinting in the dim light, froze them in place. Harold's expression faltered, confidence curdling into unease. Daniel didn't shout, he didn't threat. His voice when it came was calm and steady, the voice of authority sharpened by conviction. He informed them that the meeting was being monitored. That the association they were forming was under investigation for potential fraud and harassment. That any attempt to re-establish HOA operations under the Millstone name would constitute obstruction of justice. He told them that he wasn't there as their neighbor anymore, he was there as the law. Thunder rumbled outside, punctuating every word. No one moved, no one spoke. Only Harold held his ground, jaw clenched, eyes burning with resentment. But Daniel saw the truth behind that defiance: fear. The kind that hides behind arrogance when it knows it's already lost. Then Daniel placed a small black folder on the table. Inside were copies of new financial records, proof that Harold had been moving funds offshore under false accounts since his wife's arrest. He told him the warrant was already signed, that federal agents were on their way. The silence that followed was absolute. Within minutes, the faint wail of sirens rose through the rain. Red and blue lights cut through the darkness as cars approached the clubhouse. Harold's shoulders sagged, his mouth opening in disbelief. He looked at Daniel, eyes wide with shock, as if realizing too late that this storm, this reckoning, had been inevitable from the moment his wife touched that chain. Officers entered, papers scattered. The storm outside reached its peak. As Harold Millstone was handcuffed and led out into the rain, Daniel stood in the doorway, watching the wind sweep through the empty clubhouse. The posters, the folders, the remnants of control, all of it fluttered into the mud. The empire was gone, this time for good. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere again. Police chief ends second wave of HOA corruption. Husband of infamous HOA chair arrested in new scheme. And for the first time since it had all begun, Daniel felt something close to peace. He drove to the hospital that afternoon, where Lily was waiting for her latest checkup. She smiled as he entered, small, gentle, her face brighter than it had been in months. He sat beside her, holding her hand as rain drizzled outside the window. She told him she'd had a dream the night before. In it, the house was full of sunlight again, the porch clean, the air warm. "No chains," she said softly. He smiled, his throat tightening. "No chains," he promised. Outside, Willow Grove began to heal at last. Houses looked the same, pastel walls, picket fences, quiet streets, but something fundamental had changed. The fear was gone. The rules that once suffocated the residents were now just memories whispered about on evening walks. Karen Millstone's name faded into history, a warning etched into the town's folklore. Her husband's conviction sealed the final chapter. And Daniel Grayson, once just a father searching for peace, had become something greater. Not a hero, not a symbol, but a reminder that justice, when done right, doesn't roar, it endures. As he stood once more on his porch that evening, the air clear after the storm, he looked at the old swing where Lily used to sit. The spot where everything began. The metal had been replaced, the wood freshly painted. It no longer symbolized pain, it symbolized survival. He breathed in deeply, the sound of distant thunder rolling away into silence. The storm had passed, the chains were broken. And the man who had once lived quietly among tyrants had become their reckoning. For the first time in years, the night in Willow Grove was peaceful, truly peaceful.